All right. Well, we'll
Tell me-
start commencing. Thank you, Georgia. Can I ask you to do the acknowledgement and the introduction?
Yes. Hello, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the beautiful lands of the Camriagal people, who continue to have an ongoing cultural connection. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And today we are really lucky to have an exciting guest speaker, Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann, who is a linguist and an international expert and scholar in language reclamation and language revitalization. He is a professor of linguists and the chair of endangered linguists and at the University of Adelaide. And the Indigenous Game Changers team here at IPPE are really honoured to be working with Ghil'ad on our Deadly Languages project. And we're really excited to and lucky to have you present with us today. Thanks, Ghil'ad.
Thank you so much, Georgia. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes.
Excellent. Georgia, thank you, and Ricky, and of course Zlatko and all the other people here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I thank the Vice Chancellor for being the first one to mention the Positive Psychology Education Institute to me, which resulted in me meeting Georgia and many other wonderful people. So it's really great. I have just arrived back in Australia from Taiwan, talking to 16 Aboriginal tribes, to which I went from New Caledonia, talking to 28 Aboriginal tribes. So this is the number of the Kanak languages of New Caledonia. And today is related to these trips, field trips, language revival and Aboriginal well-being, from the promised land where I was born to the lucky country where I reside. Of course, promised land in quotation marks, lucky country in quotation marks, and you can feel the gap within the quotation marks. Ngadlu tampinti Garna miuna yakta matanya wama tandanyaku. This is in Ghana, the language of Adelaide. Ngadlu means we. Tampinti means no, K-N-O-W. Garna means Ghana, which means people in Ramijeri, which is another language. So Ghana is an exonym. It's the name given to the Ghana people of Adelaide by other people. A little bit like, say, Tedesco in Italian means German, whereas Deutsch is the endonym within the German language. Miuna means people in Ghana itself. So Ghana Miuna means literally people, people. But because Ghana is the name for the people of Adelaide, then we say Ghana people. Yarta means land. Matanya means owner. Wama means plain. Tandanya means the rock of the red kangaroo, that's Adelaide, and ku means of. So coming back to what it means, this acknowledgement of country, literally it means we know, Ghana people, land owners, plain Adelaide of. So we know that Ghana people are the landowners of the plains of Adelaide. The acknowledgement of country that I've just conducted in Ghana, because I'm at the University of Adelaide, could have never been possible without the reclamation of the Ghana language, which had been subject to linguicide or language killing. So this is not just an acknowledgement, kind of pro forma lip service, façon de parler, tokenistic acknowledgement. This is actually an exemplification of what language reclamation allows us to do in language. This is a book that I published recently during COVID. It's called Revivalistics. You can see the sticks that I took a photo of in Barngarla land in Galinyala, Port Lincoln. And the talk today corresponds with this book that I think I gave Georgia, or at least I recommended Georgia to get to the library of the Australian Catholic University. Language revival has to do with resources. Now, ironically, most languages in the world are not written traditionally. So we have 7,000 languages being spoken today. More than 3,500 languages do not have a script traditionally. But in order to reclaim a sleeping beauty or a dreaming beauty in the case of Aboriginal languages, we need resources, and often these resources are written. Sometimes they are also technological. In order to revive a language, I've mentioned a sleeping beauty, we need a resilience, a lot of resilience. It's not like kissing the sleeping beauty and then the sleeping beauty suddenly wakes up. We need to go there for the long run. That's your humble servant on the left with Muhammad Ali on the right. If you know anything about boxing, he was there for the long run. He was not like a Rambo or a Rocky, apropos Ricky. He was not like a knockout person, but rather he was an athlete. He was there until his opponent just collapsed. This is exactly what you need in language revival. In Aboriginal revival, you need resilience. Language revival has to do with well-being, and this is something I'm going to talk to you today about. This is Clamor Wilhelm Schumann. He was a German Lutheran missionary who arrived in Adelaide, Australia Australis, the south of the south, because Australia in Latin means south. So I live in the south of the south, South Australia. He arrived in 1838 in order to Lutheranize, Christianize the Aboriginal people. Luckily, he wrote down a dictionary of the Barngarla Aboriginal language, also of the Ghana Aboriginal language. And this dictionary, which was written for Christianization, is used today in order to reconnect with the original Aboriginal spirituality. So it gives us a very beautiful righting the wrong of the past, which is symmetric, and I believe that it is in line with the beautiful values of the Australian Catholic University that have to do with what I call in Yiddish Menschlichkeit. Menschlichkeit in Yiddish, which is a Jewish language, has to do with being humane and being socially aware. So in the case of Aboriginal cultures, Aboriginal languages, Australian Catholic University is menschlich in the sense that it would like to use resources that were done for Christianization for actually reconnecting with your Aboriginal spirituality, thus symmetrically righting the wrong of the past. Now, I mentioned technology. This is a part of an app. It's a screenshot of an app that I developed together with the Barngarla people. You can download this Barngarla app in any smartphone that you have. It doesn't matter, iPhone or Android. And here you see Harry Dare. He was a Stolen Generations member at the age of 4. He was stolen, kidnapped from his mother. Of course, the kidnappers were not criminals in the sense of like criminals in China that steal babies, or like the little baby that was kidnapped in America this week and luckily was found. It was not this kind of criminal. He was kidnapped by the government. So the government, as you know, between 1901 and 1971, when I was born, for 70 years, the government used to steal babies or children who were of mixed race. One of them is Harry Dare. Harry Dare is here as part of the technological app that we have created in order to fight the loss of languages, which was the result of, surprise, among other things, technology. So technology killed Aboriginal languages. When I say technology, I mean ships of the Anglo-Celtic colonizers, I mean weapons, I mean black cars that took the person who kidnapped Harry Dare from his mother. These are technological tools. we use technology in order to reconnect with languages that had been killed by people using technology. So this is another righting the wrong of the past that language revival gives us. This is why it is a very beautiful, multifaceted endeavor, language revival. This is just the first Barngarla reclamation workshop that I conducted in Ghil'ad together with the Barngarla people. Howard Richards, you can see him here with a blue shirt. He was a Stolen Generations person as well. This is another Bangalidi Manu learning and speaking Barngarla together workshop in 2018. You can see more and more people are joining our efforts. The main question of today's Zombie lecture, I call it Zombie because you know, COVID, the panic or the pandemic made us all zombies in the sense that we use Zoom or Microsoft Teams in this case. I am a face-to-face person, so when I deal with Aboriginal people, I go to the bush and therefore I travel a lot. I've been almost every place in Australia. Why on earth should we invest time and money in reviving dead languages? I say dead in quotation marks. As I said earlier, I call these languages sleeping beauties. And in the case of Aboriginal sleeping beauties, I call them dreaming beauties, like Jukurpa, you know, dream time. It doesn't matter that dream time is a mistranslation. We know now this term as Aboriginal spirituality element. So I'm going to give you briefly, because we only have an hour in total, and I would like to have some questions as well. I'm going to give you the first thing: ethical reason, what is right; aesthetic reason, what is beautiful, we are humans; and utilitarian beautiful reason, what is useful. And here I will talk about health and well-being. There are many related questions that we could answer. I will maybe answer very briefly because we will not have time to answer them deeply. Should we financially compensate Indigenous people for the loss of their native tongues? The answer is absolutely yes, because in fact, language is more important than land, in my humble opinion. I do not represent any person, I'm not Aboriginal, but I believe that language is more important than land. Now, if we give money for the loss of land, then why not give money for the loss of languages? Of course, this money is not going to be for fun. It's going to be, well, it's going to be for language activities, which happen to be fun. Should Indigenous languages be defined as official languages, for example, of Australia? Absolutely yes. As you know, in Australia, there are no official languages. English is de facto, but it's not de jure. In New Zealand, you have two official languages. One of them is Te Reo Māori, the language Maori, and the other one is, surprise, the sign language, the deaf language. English is not de jure official language. I believe that Australia ought to follow New Zealand and define 400 Aboriginal languages as the official languages of their region, and one, surprise, sign language. English does not need to be defined as de jure because it is de facto. It doesn't really matter. Should we erect multilingual signs, changing the landscape, the linguistic landscape? Absolutely yes. We need Australia to be exactly like Wellington, New Zealand. Everything in Wellington, New Zealand, when it comes to universities, governments, everything is in English, de facto, and in Te Reo Māori, the language Maori. Does language dictate the way we think? Well, I will answer very briefly. It does not dictate, but it influences the way we think. For example, if you have a word in your language for bridge, and the word is masculine, say you speak Italian, il ponte, you would describe a bridge as sturdy, as strong. Whereas if you have a language in which the word for bridge is feminine, say German, die Brücke, you will describe a bridge as elegant, as beautiful. This is all subconscious. In other words, the gender, the grammatical gender of the specific lexical item determines the way that hoi polloi, normies, the masses, describe or conceive of a bridge in their language. Is it possible at all to reclaim a sleeping, dreaming beauty language? Here I could have talked a lot about my mother tongue, Israeli, the result of the language revival of Hebrew. It's a revival language. I would argue that Israeli is very different from Hebrew, and in fact, Israelis fail to read the Hebrew Bible without misunderstanding it. So they believe they understand it, but they actually misunderstand it. They read it as if it were Israeli. I could have given you thousands of examples, and bear in mind that in Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, you only have 8,000 words. So 8,000 distinct words, 8,000 types, out of which 2,000 are hapax legomena. They are words that only exist in the Bible once, which means that we have no idea really what they mean. So in the Bible, we have 6,000 words. I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, not about the New Testament. I'm talking about the Old Testament, which was written mainly in Hebrew. Daniel, the book of Daniel, as you know, was written in Aramaic, the language of Jesus. Look at the landscape. This is the first linguistic landscape change. Galinyala, now everybody knows that Port Lincoln is Galinyala. It did not exist a year ago. It's a new thing. Mangiri in Barngarla means healthy, well. Barngarla is the language spoken in Eyre Peninsula, which is Port Lincoln, Whyalla, Port Augusta, and many other places in that area. 8-hour drive from Adelaide without speeding tickets. So Adelaide, Port Augusta, Port Lincoln is approximately 8 hours. You can see here some signs that the Barngarla people introduced together with the local government. This is Clamott Wilhelm Schumann as well, and they talk about the Barngarla people. Here you can see your humble servant. In the middle, it's Shania Richards. If you Google Shania Richards, you can see a very fascinating and multifaceted story of suicidal ideation and rediscovery or discovering the language and empowerment, mental empowerment. On the right, you can see Lavinia. Lavinia is a stolen generations person whose father was a German, probably German Jewish, but we do not know, just his surname was Arendt, like Hannah Arendt. I would like to say that language revival is a global effort. So in the future, people will come to Georgia, people will come to your humble servant from all over the world. Well, they are already coming, but they will ask Aboriginal people, how did you revive your sleeping beauty? How did you do it? We would like to do it in Platfontein, near the Kimberley, near Kimberley, which is not in Australia, but rather in South Africa. Jungwasi people, Jungwasi has the click, just like many languages in Botswana and Namibia. These languages are unfortunately endangered. There are only 2 languages remaining with a click. This click exists in only 2 languages, whereas Jungwasi, this exists in more, but still endangered. You have the clicks like etc. These are Urak Lawoi people whom I have helped with their revival. They're the gypsies of the sea, so to speak. Their language in Thailand is extremely endangered, unfortunately. I'm a native speaker of reclaimed Hebrew, and in reality, the fantasiacal Hebrew revivalists were a small, unsupported group. We are talking about, you could count them, how many revivalists there were. And as Margaret Mead might have said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing it ever has. So don't be discouraged by a small number of revivalists. On the left, Eliezer ben Yehuda, the main Hebrew revivalist, a monomaniac, an obsessive political scientist who understood that Trinity, in his case, was not il Padre, il Figlio e lo Spirito Santo, but rather his Trinity was language, land, and lens, or as I say, lang, land, lens, lang, land, lens. And this is something that every nationhood movement realized in the fin de siècle, at the end of the 19th century. As a political scientist, he understood that you need to go to have a country, well, to have a land, so it doesn't matter whether it's Israel, the Kimberley in Australia, there was the Kimberley Plan in 1938, to have a Jewish state in the Kimberley. I wonder what would have happened with the Aboriginal Jewish relations had it happened. You know, this is kind of not utopia, but Uchronia, Uchronia, what if? But there were many other possibilities, Uganda, Birobijan, where to move the Jews who unfortunately were persecuted in Europe. He was monomaniac because he fought for the language and he was jailed. The ultra-Orthodox thought that he was desecrating the holy tongue, and they snitched him to the Turks who were around in Palestine at the time before the British mandate, and he was jailed for that. But he continued, he's resilient just like Muhammad Ali, and he in fact succeeded. A very small group of people. He had a very small group of adherents. Now, Eliezer ben Yehuda, the grandson on the right with your humble servant, they put us together in a very big newspaper article because I'm known in Israel as arguing that Israeli is not the same as Hebrew, so they thought that we would fight if they bring us together, except that we became close friends. His name is Eliezer ben Yehuda as well. He's a grandson. I'm showing you photos of Barngarla people. I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics, philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, again, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. That's John Adams, the second president of the United States of America. Perspicacious words that are, of course, very relevant to revivalistics. I would urge you to add to this third paragraph, revivalistics, positive psychology, Aboriginal language reclamation, etc. So we want our descendants to enjoy this life of, you might argue, luxury, but it's so important that luxury and basis are actually the same thing in this specific case. And this leads me to basic human needs based on Abraham Maslow's 1943. You see, if I ask you, where do most hoi polloi stand? Are they with belonging love? Let's talk about China. I would say probably belonging love, the third. I'm not talking about the Ukraine. I'm not talking about Russia. I'm not talking about Syria. I'm not talking about all these places where we have disasters, unfortunately. But let's say China, most people are in belonging love, which is in the middle. Of course, you need the battery and Wi-Fi these days. How many non-elite, so how many hoi polloi arrive at self-esteem, achievement, mastery, recognition, respect, and how many very, very, very few, I'm not talking about the professors here at ACU who are part of the elite of society, how many arrive at self-actualization, pursue inner talent, creativity, fulfillment? Very, very few. I have found my ikigai. My ikigai, the interface between what I love, what the world needs, what I'm paid for, and what I'm good at, is in fact revivalistics. That's my ikigai. But most people have not found their ikigai, and in my case, you know, it is an ikigai that is less and less desirable by the authorities. So I always say I'm endangered languages professor at the University of Adelaide, so endangered that I'm the only such professor in Australia. So endangered is not only a qualifier of the languages, but also of the professorship per se. So this ikigai is a very important concept for me, but I feel that sometimes it's being eroded. And I hope that ACU, the Australian Catholic University, from the statement by Zlatko Skrbis, I know that ACU does care more about ikigais, which are related to what I said earlier, Menschlichkeit, than other universities in Australia. Now, I would like to tell you that when we enter the later stage of our technological revolution, which we are currently in, we do not really realize it. Well, some of us do not realize it. And this technological revolution is not only the fact that I can talk to you while I'm in Sunshine Coast and you are in Sydney and maybe somebody is in the United Kingdom. Not only this zombification, this chat GPTization, etc. It's a technological revolution, but it will make us go up this basic human needs. What I'm trying to say was that industrial revolution of 1760, 1840 turned people from seeking food to seeking things. The technological revolution, which is the current revolution, in my view, will turn people from seeking things to seeking ideas. And I'm talking about hoi polloi, the masses. I'm not talking about the elite. This is a revolution, and we need to be aware of this revolution. This is when language revival will become more and more common. So we need to prepare for the future, and we need to have Aboriginal Australians becoming the leaders globally of language revival. That's, in fact, my vision. Now, I've mentioned the technological revolution. Let me just give the non-linguists here a very brief history of the four linguistic revolutions as I see it. The first linguistic revolution was speaking, the emergence of speaking, and it happened more than 70,000 years ago. And it allowed Homo sapiens sapiens to lie about the past and the future, something that animals can't do. Animals can lie about the present, but they can't lie about the future. They can't lie about the past. Also, it allows us to offend without physical violence. This is amazing. That's the revolution of speaking. The revolution of writing, which was approximately 5,200 years ago, allowed Homo sapiens sapiens to protect himself from thieves. Because how did it happen in Iraq, in Mesopotamia, that we suddenly had writing revolution? Well, we were agriculturists, so we were farmers. Because of urbanization, etc., we had wheat, a lot of wheat, and we sent it to Israel. We got, I don't know, salt in return, and we saw, there is only half the quantity. What happened? And it turned out after investigation that there was a thief on the way from Iraq to Israel. The next time I wrote down 4 units of wheat. That's the beginning of writing 5,200 years ago. Now, of course, the result is Shakespeare, etc., etc. Type printing, 1450. Johannes Gutenberg develops the first European movable type printing press, enabling mass production of books. That's a very important revolution. Technology is the 4th revolution, and it allows us big data. Let's continue to language revival. So, what is the ethical reason for language revival? I said to you earlier that I'm going to answer this big question of why on earth should we invest time and money and positions and grants and fellowships, etc., in order to do something that many people might say, well, I mean, these languages are gone. Who cares? Who gives a? Well, as Mandela might have said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart. In the background, you can see the Hebrew script. I believe in native tongue title. As I said earlier, the loss of language is more severe than the loss of land. Language death means loss of cultural autonomy. It means loss of intellectual sovereignty. It means loss of spirituality. It means loss of well-being, loss of mental health, and if you allow me a metaphor, loss of the soul. Look at Anthony Forster, 1843. The natives would be sooner civilized if their language was extinct. This is an ideology of linguicide, language killing. Look at South Australian Governor George Grey, who was more supportive of Aboriginal people relatively. The ruder languages disappear successively, and the tongue of England alone is heard around. Why does he regard the Aboriginal languages as ruder languages? Australia, as I said earlier, ought to learn from New Zealand. This is the Australian Aboriginal flag, designed by Harold Thomas. Probably there is a German influence. Don't forget that South Australia is very Germanic. Handorf, Barossa Deutsch, etc. It was flown in 1971 when I was 1 month old in Victoria Square, Adelaide. That's my own flag for the Aboriginal people, my proposed flag for a language day, reflecting the trinity of people, land, and language. The pink is lang. In Aboriginal spirituality, the language belongs to the land and the people belong to the land. That is in contradistinction, in diametric opposition to native title, in which the land belongs to the people. Actually, the more I work on Aboriginal spirituality, the more I realize that it's the opposite. The people belong to the land. So this native title disaster, in my view, causes a lot of problems in Aboriginal communities. That's my flag for for Australia in general, not just for Aboriginal Australia. Let's move to aesthetic motivations. When you lose a language, you lose a culture, intellectual wealth, a work of art. It's like dropping a bomb on a museum. The Louvre. This is Ken Hale from MIT. Look how beautiful Chabichou, Gorgonzola, Roquefort. I love cheeses. Yeah, I go to the Adelaide Central Market and I tell them, please give me the best cheeses. Now, you might say, I'm lactose intolerant, I'm lactose malabsorbent, I don't like cheeses. It's a matter of taste. It's a matter of aesthetics. Look how beautiful, how colorful Australia used to be. 400 different dialects, different languages, different cultures. Yungu has the didgeridoo, yeah. Others have the boomerang, etc., etc. It's not one people, it's many, many peoples, 400. Beautiful. Look how beautiful. Look how ugly. It is ugly for two reasons, in my view. Firstly, it's monochrome. And secondly, it has these lines which are very straight, and they're very important lines, as we unfortunately saw during the pandemic or the pandemic. For example, I was stuck between the Northern Territory and Western Australia. They didn't allow me to go from Darwin to work with the Kununurra, with the Mirung people, because the Premier decided that, you know, the borders are closed. Now, this straight line, believe it or not, is a continuation of the line that divides South America between the Spanish and the Portuguese. So, you know, Brazil and Argentina. It has nothing to do with Aboriginal culture, nothing to do with Aboriginal history, which has to do with rivers and mountains, and, you know, it's just a straight line. It's just like a bureaucrat kind of continuing that line from the other side of the world. Tordesillas, 1492, approximate Tordesillas Accord between Spain and Portugal. That's the reason for the line between Western Australia and South Australia, Northern Territory. This is what we do not want. We do not want Homo sapiens sapiens, the human who knows she knows, as opposed to animals, because animals, they know, but they do not know that they know. You cannot tell me about two cows speaking to each other, and there is a beautiful bull joining the herd, and one cow says, and the other one says, that's exactly what I wanted to say. You cannot tell me that. If it happens, I'm becoming a vegan, because it means that cows know they know. Now, cows know, but they do not know they know. We know we know. This is kind of a folk etymology or etymology for sapiens sapiens. Of course, it's not the real etymology. We do not want to become a barcode. We need to fight it. Of course, we can get there very easily and very soon. This is what we want. This is the most complex Chinese character I have ever encountered. It has 56 or 57 strokes. I counted 57 strokes. This is what we want. We want diversity. The survival of the Tasmanian devil is important. What about the survival of the Palawa languages of Tasmania? Why is it that people give a lot of money for animals, but they do not give money for languages? Well, I'm not against animals. I give money for animals. I love animals. These are orphan joeys in Little Hampton. They belong to my friend. Mamikapinatapai is an endangered grammatical way to express a familiar concept. It means to look one at the other, hoping that the other side would initiate something that both of us really want to do, but so far nobody has had the guts to initiate. Now, as a 15-year-old, I remember having this feeling, but I did not have a word for it. But as a linguist, I studied Yagan in Tierra del Fuego, in Argentina, Chile, in South America, as I said, Chile in English, and I analyze it. Ma is a reflexive prefix. Ihapi is to be at loss at what to do next. The N is a stative suffix. The ata is achievement suffix, and the apai is a dual suffix, which in composition with ma has a reciprocal sense. So it's mam ihapi n ata apai, mam ihapi natapai. The th is the one that exists in Welsh, as in Pink Floyd or Pink Floyd. You have Floyd, F-L-O-Y-D, comes from Floyd, double L. This is the th, mam ihapi natapai. On the other hand, we have some endangered concepts that will disappear if we do not have this language. Nahur in ancient Persian, a camel that will not give milk until her nostrils have been tickled. Now, this is something that I guess most people would have never been able to think about, because our imagination is extremely limited as a generalization. I must generalize because I'm a linguist. A language is a generalization. A language is an abstract ensemble of idiolects, sociolects, dialects, and other lects. So in fact, the fact that we see aliens as looking like ugly humans is a testimonium paupertatum, paupertatis for us. It's a very bad sign of our limited imagination, because of course 3.5 billion years of DNA evolution, you will never have, in my view, aliens looking like ugly human beings. I mean, this is crazy to think about it. Anyway, let's move to the most important point, utilitarian benefits of language revival. I have discovered throughout my dozens of years, decades of language revival activities all over the world, that language revival results in personal, mental, spiritual, and physical well-being, sense of pride and self-esteem. It's an antidote for self-loathing. Here is Jenna unsolicitedly writing to me in 2012 after the first Barngarla workshop. Personally, I found the experience of learning a language liberating. Went home feeling very overwhelmed because we were finally going to learn our own language. It gave me a sense of identity. And I think if the whole family learned a language, then we would all feel totally different about ourselves and each other, because it's almost like it gives you a purpose in life. Facebook comment unsolicitedly by Evelyn. A big thank you on behalf of our family here in Port Lincoln. Our ancestors are happy. As Georgia would tell you, as other Aboriginal people may tell you, when Indigenous people say our ancestors are happy, it often means that they are happy. It's a sign of self-happiness. Darcy Hallett, Michael Chandler, and Christopher Lalonde discovered in 2007 that in British Columbia, Canada, there is a correlation between youth suicide and lack of conversational knowledge in the native language. In other words, they looked at 6 Aboriginal tribes. This is how they're called, Aboriginal people or First Nations, but Aboriginal is not only in Australia, it's also in Taiwan. They call them 16 Aboriginal tribes. So Aboriginal, when I came to Australia 20 years ago, I was told Aboriginal we have only in Australia. Totally untrue. I mean, this word. They looked at 6 groups and they saw one language was totally killed, totally lost, a lot of suicide. One language was not lost at all, no suicide. And then the 4 others were kind of in correlation. I would like to argue today that just as language loss increases suicidal ideation and depression, language gain reduces ill mental health and empowers the well-being of the people involved in the revival, as well as their associates. I have been looking at that and published several articles with Alex Brown, who is an Aboriginal Aboriginal professor. We hypothesized and began to prove that there are improvements in mental health and social and emotional well-being during and following the language reclamation process that has been an NHMRC project that we actually continue to publish out of. So of course there is a lot to be said here. I'm very happy to tell you that more and more people are following our steps. So recently there was a research about Ahuatl in Mexico, finding that the Ahuatl language revival is improving the health, the mental health of Ahuatl people. Ahuatl or Nahuatl, Nahuatl is the language that gave rise to avocado, to chocolate, etc. in English. Another one is Lemko in Poland. There again, a quantitative analysis by Olko and others showing that language reclamation results in improved well-being and in fewer suicides, etc. There are many other utilitarian benefits for language revival and for bilingualism. So language revival, of course, might result in native bilingualism. It is the Aboriginal community itself that has the authority to say we want to go the full Monty, meaning our grandsons or grandchildren would speak the language perfectly, natively, like I speak Israeli, or the result of the Hebrew revival, perfectly because it's my mother tongue. Or they can say, look, we want a post-vernacular stage, just like most Maori in New Zealand, Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, also known as the land of the wrong white crowd. In New Zealand, most Maori, they know only 50 words in Maori. They do not speak Maori. So they know the word whakapapa, which means heritage. They know the word whānau, which means family. They know the word iwi, which means kayak or canoe or tribe. They would know many words like te taurawhiri, which is bundled a bundle rope. And this is the Maori Language Commission. There are many cognitive advantages of bilingualism. For example, bilingual people are more clever than themselves as monolingual. And in fact, there are even cognitive advantages of non-native bilingualism. Using a foreign language reduces decision-making biases. This is fascinating. And it might mean that, say, a vice chancellor of a university in Australia whose mother tongue is not Australian English has more chance not to make cognitive biased decisions as opposed to somebody who is the vice chancellor in his own mother tongue or in her own mother tongue. This is by Boaz Keisar, a fascinating topic, and there are more and more pieces of evidence to show that. In other words, if you are an Aboriginal person in Australia, you ought to be a native speaker of at least 2 languages, at least, if not more. In fact, I believe that every person in the future ought to be a native speaker of 4 languages. The universal language, currently American English, but it can change to Chinese or whatever, not Esperanto. The national language, so in Italy it's Italian. The heritage language, so say you are Albanian living in Italy, so it's Albanian. And the 4th language should be related to your ikigai. So if you're a French cuisine chef, then maybe you should be a native speaker of French as well. If you are an Australian opera singer, then maybe you should try to be native in, or semi-native, or at least very fluent in Italian because of bel canto, arie, etc. So 4 languages. And by the way, Aboriginal Australians used to speak 8 languages, no problem whatsoever. It was the mother's language, the father's language, the grandfather's language, the grandmother's. And then, of course, you move from one place to another. You need to speak the language of your neighbors, etc. So 8 language speech is not such a big deal in ancient Australia. I would like to conclude giving you some photos of immersion. I'll conclude with some Australian signs, Australian signs. Firstly, these signs are in Sydney, and you need to tell me whether the ticket I received on the left was justified or not justified. So that's an Australian sign. You need a paradox, a pair of doctorates to realize whether it's allowed or not. That's another Australian sign. Don't drive like a knob, K-N-O-B. Some non-Australians cannot understand it. My Chinese student asked me whether it's don't drive like a chicken because chickens go from one lane to another. Don't drive like a cock, I guess. When I saw this sign in Australia, Australis, South Australia, I said to myself, I need to take a photo. So I made because I didn't understand the sign. And I like rebuses, and so I made a very dangerous U-turn, and somebody shouted, "Don't drive like a wanker." So then I realized that it was a wanker, but this is the sign I wanted to end up with, and it summarizes my talk to you today. And after that, I'll be very happy to answer any questions or to hear any comments. If your language is endangered, do not allow it to fall asleep. If your language falls asleep, stop, revive, survive. Stop your life, revive your language, and then your culture will survive. Your intellectual sovereignty will survive. Your cultural autonomy, your spirituality, your well-being. Otherwise, you will just evaporate. I mean, culturally, you will just become just like any other person. If you revive a language, embrace the hybridity of the children's emerging tongue, because your language is never going to be the same language. Do not allow the imprisoning purism prism to interfere with language revival. Tell your friends, if you tell us, give us authenticity or give us death, the result will be death. So we should not be puristic. We should be embracing syncretism. There is nothing wrong with syncretism. On the contrary, it brings us more diversity, new diversity. If your language is healthy, say you are a speaker of English, say you're a speaker of Mandarin, consider helping others in linguistic need. There are 400 minus 12 Aboriginal tribes, because there are only 12 languages in Australia that are alive and kicking, Aboriginal languages, so it's 3%, 12 out of 400. So there are 400 minus 12, so it's 388 language groups who need your assistance. If you have the characteristics required for revivalist activities, try to help others in linguistic need. And I will open now the floor for questions. So please let me know if you have anything to say. Thank you so much. Cannot hear. Stop sharing. Okay. I cannot hear you. Maybe it's my problem or your problem.
Can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. That's good. Yeah. Did you hear me
Herb,
well?
Yep, I've got a question from Herb.
I listened to a fascinating presentation where a woman was an archaeologist, and she looked at the movement of language in the more or less the same way that a geneticist looks at migration, and was able to trace where people went from and came from by the changes in the languages. And I was thinking of that when some of the things that you were talking about. I wonder if how that relates to some of the research that you do.
So the movement of, when you say movement of languages, you mean like ancient movements? So for example,
Yes.
that we all come from Africa. Say it again.
Ancient languages.
Yeah.
How they moved.
Yes. So this is how I see it. I see, of course, it's a hypothesis because it's not easy to prove such a hypothesis. I see languages originating in Africa around Botswana, around the San language, the San, S-A-N language group, more than 70,000 years ago, which in fact allowed Aboriginal people to walk from Africa to Australia. Don't forget that the water was down, so it was possible to walk. You didn't need kayaks like the Maori who arrived in New Zealand 700 years ago. Then, of course, they needed to have canoes. But in order to arrive from Africa to Australia, say 51 to 65,000 years ago, and I say 51 to 65 because I know 51 100% sure because of DNA research. 65 is an archaeological research, and of course it is very shaky grounds, literally, so the grounds are shaky, so you can move one, so the artifact can move to another stratum, so this is why 65 is possible, but it's not 100% sure. So 51 to 65,000 years ago, I believe Aboriginal people came already with language, so maybe only one language, although it might have well be possible that we had several languages arriving in Darwin, around that area, and then some of them went clockwise and the others anti-clockwise. Of course, they didn't go to the middle of Australia. I mean, they're not stupid. They wanted to go along the coasts. I mean, firstly, you have fishing, and I mean, the coasts are obviously more safe in a way. I mean, think about it psychologically. 47,000 years ago, they met each other, surprise, in Port Lincoln, Barngarla land. We know it DNA-wise. So around Port Lincoln, this is Eyre Peninsula, 47,000 years ago. And this is when they decided, some of them, by the way, they were very impressed meeting people 5,000 years later, yeah, because they left the north and it was very, very gradual. And then they decided to go to Uluru and etc. Now, what I'm telling you is based on DNA research. It's not the spirituality of some Aboriginal tribes who might believe that they hail from, say, Uluru, Ayers Rock, etc. So we know that the center of Australia was populated later. Firstly, it was the coast. The reason why many foreigners, they say there are no Aboriginal people in Sydney, Melbourne, and Adelaide. Of course, it's untrue. There are many, but one of the reasons there are fewer than it used to be was just the white pushed them. So this is why you easily find Aboriginal people living in traditionally or more traditionally or relatively traditionally in Arnhem Land and not in Redfern. But coming back to your question about language origin, so definitely language evolved in Africa, and definitely the more you left, the more you diverged. And in fact, some people like Quentin, there is a guy called Quentin, he's a friend from New Zealand. He looks at the number of phonemes. So in some language in Africa, you have like dozens of phonemes. You have all the clicks, and then you have more phonemes like, and then etc. Whereas in Hawaii, you have a very limited number of phonemes, resulting in Portuguese being pronounced as pukiki. Portuguese in Hawaii is pukiki because there is no t and there is no g. So it becomes k. So he argues that the number of phonemes tells us the remoteness from the original language, and therefore he argues that Hawaii is kind of very remote from the original kind of hypothetical Ursprache or proto-language. Now, when it comes to Aboriginal Australia, of course I can tell you that Barngarla is related to Ghana, which is related to Wirangu, which is related to Adnyamathanha, and the relationship means that, say, several thousands of years ago, there were one tribe, and then they kind of diverged. I have no doubt about it, because there is a formula, if you want, that can analyze how long does it take to arrive at such diversity. So you take a language like Slovene and Russian, of course, they're more related to each other than Slovene and English. But of course, Slovene and English come originally from the same proto-language, which is Proto-Indo-European. But you can actually look at the the divergence and then say, okay, maybe 1,000 years ago, etc. Don't forget one thing: an English speaker cannot really read Chaucer. I mean, you need to study Chaucer. Shakespeare is hard, but still, I mean, you can see that in several hundreds of years, you have no idea what was the language before. So in other words, in 51,000 years, even if you come to Australia with one language, of course you will end up with hundreds of languages. There is it's a no-brainer. Now look, of course there were many other Aboriginal languages that might have disappeared, and we would never know about them because it was not a written tradition, it was an oral tradition. So when it comes to language kind of migration, it is fascinating, but we have to understand one thing. Humans can conquer another group of humans and force them all to speak the new language. So in other words, language DNA is not as accurate as human DNA. You have cases in which the colonizer kills the language and then, as unfortunately you see here, I mean, 400 languages, only 12 are alive and kicking. What we are doing is trying to right the wrong of the past. But if you did DNA on, say, an Aboriginal person and an Anglo person, both of them speak perfect Australian English, you would see that the DNA is totally different. But the linguistic DNA is the same. They speak exactly the same. So, I mean, I'm talking about some examples. So it's very complex, this kind of, you cannot reach DNA conclusions by looking at language DNA. You need more than that.
Thank you, Ghil'ad. Vice Chancellor?
Thank you, Ghil'ad. I really appreciate the opportunity to listen in to this talk. I was a little bit puzzled, I guess, with your comments about the relationship between the land and the language. In many ways, well, you said that language is more important than land. Now, given that I started my career as a student of nationalism, you know, we have a long tradition of thinking about language and territoriality in the same breath. So, for example, you know, Benedict Anderson is talking about imagined communities that are imagined not through their genuineness or falsity, but through the style in which they're imagined. And of course, that language is always a medium that that facilitates that imagination. So I'm really, really interested in, and we don't probably have time to unpack that completely, and I'll have to run soon as well as other people probably. But I think there is a complexity that you skipped over in that relationship between language and territory. Also, I think one thing that you didn't talk about for reasons of time, I guess, is really that these discussions around language revival always happen within a politically charged context. There is never a vacuum. So even revival of Hebrew it was very much a political project. And so the way in which we talk about indigenous languages revival, it's also very much nested within the context of a politically charged environment. So I'll leave it at that, but thank you so very much. Really great.
Okay, thank you, Zlatko. These are two very perspicacious comments. So let me start with the first one. I grew up in Eilat, and my memories, my childhood memories, are in Sinai Desert. Sinai Desert used to be part of Israel, and this is where I used to go every weekend, and we had our own beach because, you know, Eilat was a very small place, and then every Eilat person had a beach. I mean, every family had a beach. When I make a trip down memory lane, which is very hard, but I would need a passport, a visa, and a certificate that there are no terrorists, because we gave back Sinai to the Egyptians in the 80s. So I grew up in the 70s in Eilat. In other words, my territory was taken away, my childhood territory was taken away from me. I would argue that I can deal with that much more easily than I could deal with somebody banning me from speaking my mother tongue. In other words, the loss of taking you out of your territory, of course, moving you to another territory, because I mean, I'm not talking about killing you within the territory. So say you took an Aboriginal person, like many incidents in Australia, Aboriginal people, or in America, indigenous people were taken away from their land, like, and then they were sent to Oklahoma. Like Oklahoma has many Aboriginal people who do not belong to Oklahoma. This is displacement. The loss is huge. However, I would argue, and this is what I was trying to make, the argument that I was trying to make, the loss of not allowing somebody to speak his language, his heritage language, is much greater than the loss. So, for example, when you tell me, okay, Ghil'ad, from now onwards, you're not allowed to speak Hebrew. You can speak English. I'm a fluent speaker of 13 languages, but you can speak Italian, no problem whatsoever. But still, I think that there is something, as you alluded to in your Mamelosh and in your heritage tongue, that has to do with many other things. It's a gestaltic, holistic approach that, in my view, if you put a gun to my head and I need to choose to kind of de-trinitize this trinity, because of course I said there is a trinity of language, land, and lens. So you're right, it's together, and imagined community, you're right, it's kind of all the same thing. But if you put a gun to my head and said, okay, you need to choose territory or language. So you can stay in Sinai, it's your own territory, but you will not be able to speak Hebrew, or you speak Hebrew but you live in Australia. I would choose speak Hebrew and live in Australia. So this is a personal preference, and as I said, I don't represent any Aboriginal people. And of course, I'm talking about if you put a gun to the head of the Aboriginal tribe to choose between language and land. I also believe that land is very much overestimated or overrated, and language is very much underrated. So in a way, it is my ikigai, it is part of my vocation, which is part of my ikigai, to promote an understanding of the importance of language over the importance of land. Because land is already, you know, it's an industry. You have billions of dollars of lawyers and, you know, anthropologists and who do a native title, which in my view is a disaster in Australia. But this is another lecture, you know, another lecture, because of course, you know, many Aboriginal people would agree with me, by the way. It's not like, because some people might say, oh, it's politically incorrect to say that it's a disaster, but it is a disaster. So now, with regard to the other point, Zlatko, very, very perspicacious what you said, is Israel and Ben Yehuda, they wanted Hebrew to serve the national movement. It was very much a politically charged or an ideological movement to unite the Jewish people who came from all over the world under one language, one umbrella. And this was a huge advantage that the Hebrew revival had. This kind of desire to have a nation, to have a state. Aboriginal language revival, as a generalization, is not about having a state. So most Aboriginal people I work with do not want to have their own state. When I say their own state, I mean their Supreme Court, most of them do not. Of course, some of them do. I know some Aboriginal people who believe in sovereignty in the sense that they... Now, from a revivalist perspective, it would have been better for the language if they wanted to have a state. But of course, I do not say that we need to kind of have 400 states in Australia. That's not what I'm saying. But from a linguistic revivalistic perspective, it would have been it would have been an advantage. I think that many Aboriginal people they see language as the Maori see language. I mean, the Maori do not want to have Maori stan or Maori land instead of so like another country as opposed to New Zealand. They want to be part of the system, and of course they have a better state because they're like 17%. Aboriginal people in Australia are 2.5%. So it's like politically they're very kind of miserable. I mean, when it comes to numbers. So I think that many Aboriginal people I work with, they would like to revive their language for cultural reasons, not for national reasons. When I say national, I mean to get a state. And of course, it means that it's all possible. It's very possible. I mean, it's not a condition that is necessary to have a statehood ambition. It's not necessary. There have been language revivals in the world without statehood. However, when you have a statehood, it gives you a huge advantage. So, but I totally agree with you. There is a politically charged element here, but it's not the same element. It's a different political charge in Australia compared with Israel. If one day in Western Australia there will be a specific tribe who would end up having a small state of Aboriginal state, etc., speaking the language, say Nyunga or whatever, it will not surprise me, but it's not the case that I do what I do for that reason.
Thank you, Ghil'ad. Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Look, because of the time, can I just ask Professor Craven to say some closing words and to thank, yes.
Ghil'ad, thank you so much. You are truly inspirational. And look, you are making, your work makes a real difference. It makes a real difference on the ground with the kids that we work with the elders that we work with. We're so appreciative of having the opportunity to work with you. Fingers crossed our ARC grant gets up. We really want it, don't we, Georgia? Because we're dying to work with you. And thank you. You've been inspirational today, and we've learnt a lot from you. And we in IPPE look forward to continuing to work with you. So thank you, and thank you, Vice Chancellor, for joining us today. We appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good
Thank you.
afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Ghil'ad. All right, have safe travels.